Hello, and welcome to another Axim Global webinar, this time on the MITRE ATT&CK Framework. And this time we're going to do a deep dive on this subject. Before we head into the presentation, a couple of quick points. So first of all, as you've probably noticed, you will be muted throughout the call. However, on your webinar client, you do have a question section. So at any point throughout the webinar, if you've got any questions, please put them into the question section. We are recording them, and we will have a Q&A session at the end of this webinar. I would also want to make sure that you understand that that this webinar is being recorded, and we will make the recording of this webinar available on our website as well as on our YouTube channel. And last but not least, please do follow us on our LinkedIn and Twitter channels for news on SentryWire and upcoming webinars. Okay, with that, I'm very happy and very privileged to be able to hand over to Josh Williams, who will be presenting this webinar. Josh, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. And greetings to those of you that are attending and those of you that are watching this on rebroadcast. This afternoon, or this session, we'll be discussing in more depth the MITRE ATT&CK Framework, and ATT&CK stands for Adversarial Tactics, Techniques, and Common Knowledge. And the framework was derived over multiple years of data analysis from every available breach or hack or unauthorized access, both in public networks and in private air-gap networks. It's globally accessible and it essentially categorizes the adversarial techniques that were used in every single unauthorized access or breach or hack or attack. It's really a foundational framework that we're seeing more and more vendor tools orient what they provide and the alerting that they provide and the anomalous detection around the framework. And it's open and available to really anyone that has a desire to participate or to use it in their organization, and it can be found at the URL that you see on the bottom of the slide. Now, essentially, it is an exercise in organizing the actions that malicious or inept insiders and or external actors take while on a network, while they're gaining unauthorized access, or while they're doing the activity that they want to accomplish on someone else's network. And it is essentially spread across the 11 high-level tactics, those are initial access to the target network, execution of whatever it is, whatever the malicious intent is, remaining and evading detection, that's persistence and defensive evasion, escalating the privilege level by gaining access to credentials, using discovery and lateral movement, and gathering together the artifacts or the files or the information that the malicious actor or insider wants to take away from the network, and then finally, command and control and exfiltration. If you look at the bottom right of the screen, you'll see this depicted in a process flow where we show either existing access, which is an insider activity, someone that has already has an account provisioned inside a network, and they're either inept or they're acting maliciously. And by inept, I mean putting a USB drive into, a computer inside their network, a drive that they found in the parking lot, for instance. And then you'll see that the process flow is essentially as depicted, and it's not very linear at times. Oftentimes it's an iteration through discovery, lateral movement, privilege escalation, defensive evasion, and so on. Underneath each of these tactics, you can see this is an eye chart, but underneath each of these tactics are various techniques that are used to achieve unauthorized access to a component of a network or some asset within the network. Starting with that initial access, you can see some of the techniques themselves are articulated there: drive-by, compromise, exploitation of a public-facing application, bolting on, retrofitting hardware additions, and so on. And you can imagine just from the generic description of those techniques that there are multiple ways to accomplish those techniques, and more those are being called sub-techniques. Now, each of these techniques has been given a unique identifier by MITRE. It's an alphanumeric identifier. And you'll see as we go further along in this presentation that those unique identifiers are quite useful. So that's a review of what the attack framework is. And what I'd like to do now is talk about a couple of real-world applications for the framework itself. How does a security practitioner use the framework in the real world? Probably the least level of effort method is by identifying gaps. To use the framework to identify gaps in the enterprise coverage, in the enterprise suite of tools, or the security posture of an enterprise. And the approach for identifying gaps is fairly straightforward. I recommend there'll be some recommendations interspersed throughout the webinar. But the first recommendation is to familiarize yourself and your team with the framework. That's at the URL that we discussed. It's actually getting quite prominent now, the attack framework. But familiarize yourself with the different tools and access and API approaches for using the tool, and then particularly focus on the data sources within the context of the framework. Obviously, the techniques are bucketized according to the tactic, one of those 11 tactics, and then each of the techniques has description about how the technique is used or put into place. And as part of that, the technique, the data source that you can use to detect or identify that technique is happening is listed. And the data sources you see at the table to the right on this slide, you'll see the various types of data sources that give you insight that you would use to determine whether or not one of these techniques is happening in your network. Now, some of these techniques are completely benign and expected behavior in a development shop or for any number of reasons. People legitimately gathering multiple files about a specific project and zipping them up and then encrypting them and passing them on to a partner. All of those actions would have triggered a technique. but it happens several times a day in most large organizations as people conduct knowledge transfer and conduct general commerce and interaction with their partners. The reason I'm saying that is this framework will not provide a one-to-one match for an alert and malicious activity. But you must start with an inventory of all of the tools in the enterprise that are available. So if the enterprise has a log correlation and aggregation tool like Elasticsearch or Logstash or Splunk, you can use that tool to check off the block in one of these data sources. So you'll see that in the data source itself that they will say, you have to monitor this process. Way to monitor that process and get the output is usually a resulting log file of what the process is being used for. So you want to make sure you have a comprehensive inventory of all that's available. And frequently in large organizations, we find that there are different stakeholder groups that use different tools to do their job. And so there will be some amount of sleuthing or discovery internal for the inquisitive security practitioner to find out if the network management or data center ops team has Splunk and what it is that they're monitoring with their Splunk infrastructure. Then the next step is to reconcile the inventory where you've taken an inventory of the tools that you have, a next-gen firewall, or a Windows registry monitoring, or a SIM, or you've got NetFlow, or you've got a DNS syslog correlation platform somewhere, and match those off, match the inventory, or reconcile the inventory with the attack data sources. And then the third and final step is to prioritize then the gaps. So for instance, if you don't have any packet capture, that would be a significant gap. Or if you're not doing any monitoring of your authentication or Windows events, those would be significant gaps. And so you would want to prioritize acquiring or implementing tools that will allow for that coverage. One thing to note is that in the prioritization, most of the malicious activity that we're seeing is occurring around DNS and PowerShell. So any tools or telemetry or vendor solutions that are available to give you insight into when PowerShell is being used and DNS in the enterprise, we certainly recommend making sure there's coverage there. So the next step, or the next logical option that you have, once you've conducted this inventory and identified the gaps and started to get whatever procurement needs to be started to get the tools or to repurpose them or to provision yourself an account or your team an account with the Splunk that the data center management team is using. The next option, what we would recommend an enterprise or a security team do next, is to visualize. So you're collecting the information, you've got your data sources, you can validate that the data sources are informing the tools that you want them to use. And then the next thing is to be able to visualize, just to isolate around these the techniques that comprise those 11 tactics. So you'd want a visualization that focuses every single time one of those techniques appears, you've got a data source that covers it, that identifies it, and then you have a mechanism for to visualizing those when those events take place. Of course, Splunk is always an option. It seems to be prevalent in most organizations, even in an unsanctioned state. Somebody's using Splunk in an enterprise somewhere. But as we discussed, after you've done the gap analysis from the data sources of the framework and identify what telemetry or instrumentation you need to put in place to close that gap, it's probably going to involve pointing the logs from the devices to the Splunk indexer, and then creating dashboards and tailoring the alerts. So I have a screenshot of, and there are plenty of dashboards out there. UK practitioner named Cyberzombie, is working as an ongoing project where he has built the dashboards already for getting the telemetry and instrumentation of the various data sources that will inform an attack framework visualization. That's an option, the Splunk option. And then another option that I wanted to spend some time discussing is what's called the Elastic Stack, which is essentially Elasticsearch. It's open source, and it's comprised of Elasticsearch and Kibana and Logstash, but it used to be referred to as ELK, so Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana. And I do recommend that the very first step, installing and configuring Elasticsearch and Kibana, should be done before installing and configuring Logstash. The Logstash you can think of as the Splunk indexer, if you will. It's got an indexing and parsing function. You'd want to point your syslog or your logs to that Logstash instance. And if there's, if you're starting off and you don't have any type of Elastic or ELK or any type of support to stand up this stack, I enthusiastically recommend taking a look at the SANS Institute's Sec 455 series courses. They're just fantastic. And I believe there's 2 courses, and you take those 2 courses and you'll be able to stand up the Elastic Stack in your environment and get it configured and get it, feeding from the data sources that you've identified. This is an example of an attack dashboard that Michael Hidalgo put together. And it's, again, he's got you can go to his blog and he has lots of useful information, and he's a very helpful practitioner, frankly. So that's the basics behind visualization of the techniques that your data sources that you've configured your data sources to alert on, or that you're collecting information, that you're monitoring. And then the third step is to layer on additional sources of network activity, and that you can fuse into your visualization. And the intent behind the visualization is to get to something actionable, so that the information you're looking at causes you or someone on your team to take an action that either validates that the traffic that spawned the alert is expected and benign, or that it bears further analysis and investigation. And so oftentimes you'll need additional pieces of information or other sources to inform that decision cycle or that decision flow. And probably the most authoritative data source in a network is packet capture. And so if you have a packet capture solution available, the source for this screenshot is Splunk with the attack framework, instrumentation, and the SentryWire packet capture solution, which also provides NetFlow information, and it layers in then the next-gen firewall or really any other appropriate instrumentation, so that you can correlate the activity that was triggered or alerted based on the attack framework. One of the techniques happened on the network, and using the parameters and attributes of that event, either time, or MAC address, or IP address, source, destination, port, protocol, service, you can go back to the most authoritative data source, which is packet capture, and you can replay the session or the whatever happened to see, oh yes indeed, spear phishing attack was successful on our network, because I see this email with this attachment that we've already done malware analysis, reverse engineering on, and determined that it's malicious, that it was indeed opened by this host, and this host's IP address shows that multiple other files with the same hash were present on the network or downloaded from this IP address. But the packet capture and NetFlow are quite useful in validating, confirming, or denying the presence or the occurrence of one of these techniques in a network. And I just want to take a few minutes to go over each of these resources that we've talked about and take a pause if there are any questions. But let me just, I think the first resource that any security practitioner or team should review when implementing the MITRE ATT&CK Framework is the MITRE site. There are multiple ways to view the techniques. This link that I provided in this webinar presentation will take you to what they call the enterprise technique view, so that no matter what operating system or what type of devices you have, all of the techniques that are applicable to all of the operating systems or various environments will be present in this view. As you familiarize yourself with the portal, you'll see that you can drill down to, by operating system, by mobile, by the usual suspects in terms of the categories and the types of devices or assets you might have in your enterprise. The next resource that's listed is the SANS Institute, fantastic organization with really a long history of delivering the best training, really world-class training. They have multiple other related organizations that are nonprofit I know some of the instructors who are just, they take time out from being in the fight to put these courses together and to, all over the United States, really all over the world, to provide the training to technology professionals, but mostly security practitioners. And as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, the SEC 455 series courses will be absolutely invaluable if you have zero Elastic Stack experience, and I enthusiastically recommend them. And then the final two resources, I could have listed several in this section, but they're organizations that have invested time and energy in the framework itself, and have come up with multiple approaches that will ease the practitioner or the security team, ease their transition to using the framework as part of their daily operations, or just in terms of threat hunting, or really any activity that an enterprise would want to undertake that would increase or optimize the security posture. There's a wealth of information because the framework itself is open and available globally. That seems to engender a community giving back attitude, and those two links that I have listed there, Red Canary in particular, these folks really seem to have bought into that, and are very helpful to any team looking to implement the attack framework in their environment. So let me just take a pause and see if there are any questions that I can answer.
Hey, Josh. Well, first of all, many thanks for the presentation and for these interesting insights. As always, learned a lot. There's a couple of questions here. So let me see. One of the questions relates to potentially software products that can help more effectively apply the framework. So I know you talked about the framework, but the question is really if there is any software products to consider that may help with the implementation and the usage of it.
Yes, actually, we're seeing very many of the tools in the ecosystem, in the security ecosystem and the network monitoring ecosystem, are starting to adopt the framework. So I will use one example, most recently the tool TripWire. I think it's a fairly common tool, well known. It's a very useful tool. It's actually a suite of complementary network telemetry and network traffic visualizations, but they have done a fantastic job of taking the framework, the applicable techniques that they are the data source for, and visualizing it in their common operating picture across all of their interfaces. And TripWire is not alone in doing that. I've interacted with them recently, and know that they're committed to this. Checkpoint is another. It's just one of those legacy security tools that really, was a trailblazer and continues to innovate. But they've also adopted the framework, or at least the capability of easily visualizing the techniques that are happening, for which they would be the data sources. So eventually, one could imagine that the very infrastructure itself in the operating systems would start to adopt the MITRE ATT&CK Framework in some way, shape, or form, so that, you know, when those events, when those techniques were present just natively in the infrastructure or the operating system, that there would be some alerting mechanism. Not sure how far away we are from that, but those two tools that I mentioned, they're a very simple web search of the attack framework will result in a list of vendors that are starting to adopt it. Did that answer the question?
Yes, I guess so. Thank you. The one question here was just, you know, how do you get, if you're interested in, how do you get more actively involved?
Yeah, I think with anything, and it's a time investment. This is a first step, learning more about the framework. But there are multiple like sub-technique working groups that have sprung up really across the globe. So they're informal, but the last two entries on my resources slide, you'll see that there are people going about their business and doing their job of reducing risk exposure in enterprises, or however they've become involved or aware of the attack framework, and it's piqued their interests, and they've developed either an approach or a dashboard or additional sub-techniques, and they provide that information, they present that information, much like what I'm doing right now. So it really does not take much initiative to get involved and to really help spread the word. Make sense?
Yep, it certainly does. Thank you very much. So, I mean, the framework still is very comprehensive, and it can obviously be pretty daunting for somebody who's looking at this the first time and starting to use the framework, but at the same time wanting to adopt it. So the question is, you know, any tips for somebody who's, if you want, interested but wants to sort of take a practical step to start to use it? Any tips from your side?
Well, I would say I would ask this: is this person a practitioner, or is this person, you know, depending on their role and what access they have, I enthusiastically recommend starting around DNS and PowerShell. So by that I mean looking at the techniques and developing sub-techniques to that are around the domain name service and the PowerShell, because those two areas have the most malicious, unauthorized activity that we've seen, and by going at it from that perspective, it's not so daunting. There's a subset of the techniques that of the techniques in those areas, and then going through the exercise and the effort to develop the sub techniques. So, you know, if we're using the port knocking technique as an example, there's multiple, you know, benign uses for port knocking to, you know, conceal the people use it for access control, so that, you know, only the right people can gain access to a specific port. So they'll knock a sequence of ports, and that sequence of ports will be the right sequence, and then they'll be able to, you know, access an asset. So that's an example of there's quite a few sub-techniques that can be identified from that single technique. Similar with DNS. You can look at the size of the DNS session. You can look at the time to live. And as you start to get familiar with those techniques, their associated sub-techniques, and the data sources around them, the framework, in my experience, then the framework, you have a deeper understanding of the framework and you're able to pivot to additional techniques. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think that's definitely helpful. Let's see. There's just one question here, which is really more, I mean, you've listed a number of resources and other frameworks, but there's the question here about ISO 27002, how that fits with MITRE. How do these two align from your perspective?
Okay, well, that's a good question. That came from a security practitioner, I can tell. So the ISO framework is a risk management framework, and so from that perspective, the framework is focused on security controls around a family of disciplines: training and audit and access control, and so there are a series of control statements that the theory goes, if the organization implements these controls, strong passwords, password perishability, least privilege, privileged account monitoring, all, everything that security controls seek to address, if the organization successfully implements these controls, then they have cost effectively reduced their risk. So that's really any risk management framework. The data security standard for PCI, the FISMA, the HIPAA framework, anything that is a risk management framework is really the practice, putting into practice risk management theory. So that's that type of framework. The attack framework is exclusively focused on the threat actors, exclusively. So irrespective of what risk management framework the organization has in place, if any, the CIS, NIST, FISMA, the payment card industry, or none, just or a hybrid. So irrespective of what the risk management framework is inside an organization, the attack framework allows the hunters, the security practitioners in an organization to narrow their focus on the signal that proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that every malicious actor has taken. It's one or multitude of these techniques. And so it doesn't matter the risk management framework that's in place. It allows the people charged with, protecting the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of their enterprises, systems, and information. It allows them to focus acutely and precisely on what the threat actors are doing. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think this makes a lot of sense, at least to me. So, very clear. Thank you.
Well, can you unmute the practitioner that asked it, or maybe they have a follow-on question or something?
Yeah.
This is a very good question.
Yeah, no, I think this is, and then just finally, just one last question here still. You were talking about packet capture as part of an additional source that you can use. Can you maybe just talk a little bit more as to how you can use packet capture to inform decisions, and how it fits with the attack framework, and how the two of them essentially create like a 1 + 1 becomes 3?
Oh, sure. I'm glad to. So packet capture is it's a way of making a copy of all of the network traffic that happens. And it's usually accomplished by taking what's called a test access port, a TAP, if you will, a copy of a full duplex copy of the traffic on a switch. Usually you either have some sort of aggregation infrastructure in place, Ixia, Gigamon, or you go to a switch and you provision a TAP on the switch. Now, usually switches don't have the resources to spare to make a copy of all that traffic, and so generally larger and most enterprises will come to the point where they say, hey, we need resources to make a copy of this traffic because we're monitoring it, or we're doing, there's lots of tools that need a copy of the traffic to tell us the health of our network, to troubleshoot applications, to make sure a data center is up and running. There's plenty of reasons to have a copy of the traffic. Think of it as video surveillance for your network. And so all the traffic, everything, is dumped into a TAP that is then ingested by the recording device. And think of the recording device as, say, TiVo for your television feed, where it indexes it, it brings everything in, and it says this is from this network, and this is this show, and this show starts here and ends here, and that's what packet capture essentially does. A good packet capture tool, it will take the network traffic and it will make a copy of it, and then while it's making a copy of it, it will, of course, create indices, index it, timestamp it, so that you can know authoritatively, okay, this stream of packets so it came into our network at this time, and it's associated with this source and destination, and then allow for search and retrieval. And it's similar with NetFlow, which is where metadata about a transaction or a connection is captured and correlated. Then we correlate it with the packets that have been captured. And packets are, not to be condescending, but packets are like the smallest unit of measure in a, think of them like molecules in chemistry and the natural sciences. That's packets. That's what packets are. And so you're making a copy, an authoritative copy of the traffic. You're not using logs. You've actually made a copy of it. And maybe that traffic, exists at rest somewhere. Maybe that file that was sent over, or that email, it exists at rest on someone's computer, on an MTA server, what have you. But when you're doing packet capture, you have that whole transaction recorded, from the handshake of the server to the client, from everything that was upstream, all the information from on the other side of the DMARC or the point of presence, that you have a copy of. Once it hits that switch, you can authoritatively say, oh yes, I see this. This is what happened when you're doing packet capture. You're not reconstructing based on metadata. And so its usefulness inside an enterprise is obviously one could understand how security folks would like to see it. They would like to have access to it, but there's also people who respond to outages or trouble tickets. Someone says, my computer started acting funny, or my internet's slow. You know, your help desk or your IT support, what have you. Oftentimes, they can really only resolve an issue by looking at a copy of the network traffic, and you only get that through packet capture. So we have security practitioners, and we have help desk, network support people, and then we have disaster recovery people who do their training or marketing. There's plenty of stakeholder groups that would love to have a record of the traffic. Again, a good word picture to think of it is as video surveillance for your network. Did that answer the question?
I think it does. So, I mean, in summary, if I'm understanding this correctly, what you're saying is you've got, this video surveillance, so you've got full recording of everything that happened. And on the other hand, you've got the framework, which gives you all of these sort of the steps that attackers will take. So with this authoritative data source and the framework in hand, I can use some of these techniques and go and query my recording to see whether this has potentially happened to me. And if I've got full evidence of everything that happened, that's what you're saying, right?
Yeah, you said it so much better than I did, Andrew. You should be doing this.
I don't think so. Okay, I mean, these are all of the questions, Josh. So I guess at this stage, all that remains for me to do is to, first of all, thank the attendees. So thank you very much for your interest and for taking the time to attend this webinar. And obviously to thank you, Josh, very much for your time in preparing it and the effort, and for taking the time to present to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye.